Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. It's episode 4 of Wall Street and Hitler, Chapter 6, Henry Ford and the Nazis. I would like to outline the importance attached by high Nazi officials to respect the desire and maintain the goodwill of Ford, and by Ford I mean your father, yourself, and the Ford Motor Company, Dearborn, Josiah E. Dubois, Jr., generals in gray suits. Henry Ford is often seen to be something of an enigma among the Wall Street elite. For many years in the 1920s and 30s, Ford was popularly known as an enemy of financial establishment. Ford accused Morgan and others of using war and revolution as a road to profit and their influence in social systems as a means of personal advancement. By 1938, Henry Ford in his public statements had divided financiers into two classes: those who profit from war and use their influence to bring about war for profit, and the constructive financiers. Among the latter group, he now included the House of Morgan. During a 1938 New York Times interview, Ford averred that someone once said that 60 families have directed the destinies of the nation. It might well be said that if somebody would focus the spotlight on 25 persons who handle the nation's finances, the world's real war makers would be brought into bold relief. The Times reporter asked Ford how he equated this assessment with his long-standing criticism of the House of Morgan, to which Ford replied, "There is a constructive and a destructive Wall Street. The House of Morgan represents the constructive. I have known Mr. Morgan for many years. He backed and supported Thomas Edison, who was also my good friend." After expounding on the evils of limited agricultural production allegedly brought about by Wall Street, Ford continued, "If these financiers had their way, we'd be in a war now. They want war because they make money out of such conflict, out of the human misery that war brings." On the other hand, when we probe behind these public statements, we find that Henry Ford and son Edsel Ford had been in the forefront of American businessmen who tried to walk both sides of every ideological fence in search of profit. Using Ford's own criteria, the Fords are among the destructive elements. It was Henry Ford who in the 1930s built the Soviet Union's first modern automobile plant located at Gorky, and which in the 1950s and 60s produced the trucks used by the North Vietnamese to carry weapons and munitions for use against Americans. And at the same time, Henry Ford was also the most famous of Hitler's foreign backers. And he was rewarded in the 1930s for this long-lasting support with the highest Nazi decoration for foreigners. This Nazi favor aroused a storm of controversy in the United States and ultimately degenerated into an exchange of diplomatic notes between the German government and the State Department. While Ford publicly protested that he did not like totalitarian governments, we find in practice that Ford publicly profited from both sides of World War II, from French and German plants producing vehicles at a profit for the Wehrmacht, and for U.S. plants building vehicles at a profit for the U.S. Army. Henry Ford's protestations of innocence suggest, as we shall see in this chapter, that he did not approve of Jewish financiers profiting from war, as some have, but if anti-Semitic Morgan and Ford profited from war, that was acceptable, moral, and constructive. Henry Ford, Hitler's first foreign backer. On December the 20th, 1922, the New York Times reported that automobile manufacturer Henry Ford was financing Adolf Hitler's nationalist and anti-Semitic movements in Munich. Simultaneously, the Berlin newspaper Berliner Tageblatt appealed to the American ambassador in Berlin to investigate and halt Henry Ford's intervention into German domestic affairs. It was reported that Hitler's foreign backers had furnished a spacious headquarters with a host of highly paid lieutenants and officials. Henry Ford's portrait was prominently displayed on the walls of Hitler's personal office. The wall behind his desk in Hitler's private office is decorated with a large picture of Henry Ford. In the antechamber, there is a large table covered with books, nearly all of which are a translation of a book written and published by Henry Ford. The same New York Times report commented that the previous Sunday, Hitler had reviewed the so-called Storming Battalion, 1,000 young men in brand new uniforms and armed with revolvers and blackjacks, while Hitler and his henchmen drove around in two powerful brand new autos. The Times made clear its distinction between the German monarchist parties and Hitler's anti-Semitic fascist party. Henry Ford, it was noted, ignored the Hohenzollern monarchists and put his money into the Hitlerite revolutionary movement. These Ford funds were used by Hitler to foment the Bavarian Rebellion. The rebellion failed, and Hitler was captured and subsequently brought to trial. In February 1923, at the trial, Vice President Auer of the Bavarian Diet testified, Bavarian Diet has long had the information that the Hitler movement was partly financed by an American anti-Semitic chief who was Henry Ford. Mr. Ford's interest in the Bavarian anti-Semitic movement began a year ago when one of Mr. Ford's agents, seeking to sell tractors, came in contact with Dietrich Eichhardt, the notorious Pan-German. Shortly after, Herr Eichhardt asked Mr. Ford's agent for financial aid. This agent returned to America, and immediately Mr. Ford's money began coming to Munich. Herr Hitler openly boasts of Mr. Ford's support and praises Mr. Ford as a great individualist and a great anti-Semite. A photograph of Mr. Ford hangs in Herr Hitler's quarters, which is the center of the monarchist movement. Hitler received a mild and comfortable prison sentence for Bavarian revolutionary activities. The rest from more active pursuits enabled him to write Mein Kampf. Henry Ford's book, The International Jew, earlier circulated by the Nazis, was translated by them into a dozen languages, and Hitler utilized sections of the book verbatim in writing Mein Kampf. We shall see later that Hitler's backing in the 1920s and early 30s came from the chemical, steel, and electrical industry cartels rather than directly from individual industrialists. In 1928, Henry Ford merged his German assets with those of the IG Farben chemical cartel. A substantial holding, 40% of Ford Motor AG of Germany, was transferred to IG Farben. Karl Bosch of IG Farben became head of Ford AG Motor in Germany. Simultaneously in the United States, Edsel Ford joined the board of American IG Farben. See Chapter 2. Henry Ford receives a Nazi medal. A decade later, in August 1938, after Hitler had achieved power with the aid of the cartels, Henry Ford received the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, a Nazi decoration for distinguished foreigners. The New York Times reported it was the first time the Grand Cross had been awarded in the United States and was to celebrate Henry Ford's 75th birthday. The decoration raised a storm of criticism within Zionist circles in the U.S. Ford backed off to the extent of publicly meeting with Rabbi Leo Franklin of Detroit to express his sympathy for the plight of German Jews. My acceptance of a medal from the German people, said Ford, does not, as some people seem to think, involve any sympathy on my part with Nazism. Those who have known me for many years, that anything that breeds hate is repulsive to me. The Nazi medal issue was picked up in a Cleveland speech by Secretary of Interior Harold Ickes. Ickes criticized both Henry Ford and Colonel Charles A. Lindbergh for accepting Nazi medals. The curious part of the Ickes speech, made at a Cleveland Zionist Society banquet, was his criticism of wealthy Jews and their acquisition and use of wealth. A mistake made by a non-Jewish millionaire reflects upon him alone, but a false step made by a Jewish man of wealth reflects upon his whole race. This is harsh and unjust, but it is a fact that must be faced. Perhaps Ickes was tangibly referring to the role of the Warburgs in the IG Farben cartel. Warburgs were on the board of IG Farben in the United States and Germany. In 1938, the Warburgs were being ejected by the Nazis from Germany. Other German Jews, such as the Oppenheim bankers, made their peace with the Nazis and were granted honorary Aryan status. Ford Motor Company assists the German war effort. A post-war congressional committee investigating American support for the Nazi military effort described the manner in which the Nazis succeeded in obtaining U.S. technical and financial assistance as quite fantastic. Among other evidence, the committee was shown a memorandum prepared in the offices of Ford Werke AG on November the 25th, 1941, written by Dr. H.F. Albert to R.H. Schmidt, then president of the board of Ford Werke AG. The memo cited the advantages of having a majority of the German firm held by Ford Motor Company in Detroit. German Ford had been able to exchange Ford parts for rubber and critical war materials needed in 1938 and 1939, and they would not have been available to do that if Ford had not been owned by the United States. Further, with a majority American interest, German Ford would more easily be able to step in and dominate the Ford holdings throughout Europe. It was even reported to the committee that two top German Ford officials had been in a bitter personal feud about who was to control Ford of England, such as that one of them finally got up and left the room in disgust. According to evidence presented to the committee, Ford Werke AG was technically transformed in the late 1930s into a German company. All vehicles and their parts were produced in Germany by German workers using German materials under German direction and exported to European and overseas territories of the United States and Great Britain. Any needed foreign raw materials, rubber, and non-ferrous metals were obtained through the American Ford Company. American influence had been more or less converted into a supporting position for the German Ford plants. At the outbreak of the war, Ford Werke placed itself at the disposal of the Wehrmacht for armament production. It was assumed by the Nazis that as long as the Ford Werke AG had an American majority, it would be possible to bring the remaining European Ford companies under German influence, i.e. that of Ford Werke AG, and so execute Nazi greater European policies. Policies in the Ford plants in Amsterdam, Antwerp, Paris, Budapest, Bucharest, and Copenhagen. A majority, even if only a small one, of Americans is essential for the transmittal of the newest American models, as well as American production and sales methods. With the abolition of the American majority, this advantage, as well as the intervention of the Ford Motor Company to obtain raw materials and exports, would be lost, and the German plant would practically only be worth its machine capacity. And of course, this kind of strict neutrality, taking an international rather than a national viewpoint, had earlier paid off for the Ford Motor Company in the Soviet Union, where Ford was held in high regard as the ultimate of technical and economic efficiency to be achieved by the Stakhanovites. In July 1942, word filtered back to Washington from Ford of France about Ford's activities on behalf of the German war effort in Europe. The incriminating information was promptly buried, and even today, only part of the known documentation can be traced in Washington. We do know, however, that the U.S. Consul General in Algeria had possession of a letter from Maurice Dollfus of French Ford, who claimed to be the first Frenchman to go to Berlin after the fall of France, to Edsel Ford about a plan by which Ford Motor could contribute to the Nazi war effort. French Ford was to produce 20 trucks a day for the Wehrmacht, which, wrote Dollfus, is better than our less fortunate French competitors are doing. The reason is that our trucks are in very large demand by the German authorities, and I believe that as long as the war goes on, and at least for some period of time, all that we shall produce will be taken up by the German authorities. I will satisfy myself by telling you that the attitude you have taken, together with your father of strict neutrality, has been an invaluable asset for the production of your companies in Europe. Dollfus disclosed the profits from this German business were already 1.6 million francs, and the net profits for 1941 were no less than 58 million francs. Because the Germans paid promptly for Ford output, on receipt of this news, Edsel Ford cabled, "Delighted to hear you are making progress. Your letter is most interesting. Fully realize great handicap you are working under. Hope you and your family are well. Regards, S. Edsel Ford." Although there is evidence that European plants owned by Wall Street interests were not bombed by the U.S. Air Force in World War II, this restriction apparently did not reach the British bombing command. In March 1942, the Royal Air Force bombed the Ford plant at Poissy, France. A subsequent letter from Edsel Ford to Ford General Manager Sortison about the RAF raid commented, "Photographs of the plant on fire were published in American newspapers, but fortunately no reference was made to the Ford Motor Company." In any event, the Vichy government paid Ford Motor Company 38 million francs as compensation for damage done to the Poissy plant. This was not reported in the U.S. press and would hardly be appreciated by those Americans at war with Nazism. Dubois asserts that these private messages from Ford in Europe were passed to Edsel Ford by Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long. This was the same Secretary Long who 1 year later suppressed private messages to the State Department concerning the extermination of Jews in Europe. Disclosure of these messages conceivably could have been used to assist these desperate people. A U.S. Air Force bombing intelligence report written in 1943 noted that principal wartime activities of the Ford plant are probably manufacture of light trucks and of spare parts for all the Ford trucks and cars in service of Axis Europe, including captured Russian Molotovs. The Russian Molotovs were, of course, manufactured by the Ford-built works at Gorky, Russia. In France during the war, passenger automobile production was entirely replaced by military vehicles, and for this purpose, 3 large additional buildings were added to the Poissy factory. The main building contained about 500 machine tools, all imported from the United States, and including a fair sprinkling of the more complex types, such as Gleason gear cutters, Bullard automatics, and Ingersoll borers. Ford also extended its wartime activities into North Africa. In December 1941, a new Ford company, Ford Afrique, was registered in France and granted all the rights of the former Ford Motor Company Ltd. Of England in Algeria, Tunisia, French Morocco, French Equatorial, and French West Africa. North Africa was not accessible to British Ford, so this new Ford company, registered in German-occupied France, was organized to fill the gap. The directors were pro-Nazi and included Maurice Dolphus, Etzel Ford's correspondent, Roger Messis, described by the U.S. Algiers Consul General as known to this office by repute as unscrupulous, is stated to be 100% pro-German. The U.S. Consul General reported that propaganda was common in Algiers about the collaboration of French-German-American capital and the questionable sincerity of the American war effort. There was already pointing an accusing finger at a transaction which has been long for a subject of discussion in commercial circles. In brief, there is a documentary evidence that Ford Motor Company worked on both sides of World War II. If the Nazi industrialists brought to trial at Nuremberg were guilty of crimes against mankind, then so must be their fellow collaborators in the Ford family, Henry and Etzel Ford. However, the Ford story was concealed by Washington, apparently like almost everything else that could touch upon the name and sustenance of the Wall Street financial elite. Chapter 7. Who financed Adolf Hitler? The funding of Hitler and the Nazi movement has yet to be explained in exhaustive depth. The only published examination of Hitler's personal finances is an article by Oron James Hale, Adolf Hitler Taxpayer, which records Adolf's brushes with the German tax authorities before he became Reichskanzler. I think it's supposed to be Reichschancellor. In the 1920s, Hitler presented himself to the German taxman as merely an impoverished writer living on bank loans with an automobile bought on credit. Unfortunately, the original records used by Hale do not yield the sources of Hitler's income, loans, or credit, and German law did not require self-employment or professional persons to disclose in detail the sources of income or the nature of services rendered. Obviously, the funds for the automobiles, private security, Rudolf Hess, another assistant, a chauffeur, and expenses incurred by political activity came from somewhere. But like Leon Trotsky's 1917 stay in New York, it is hard to reconcile Hitler's known expenditures with the precise source of his income. Some early Hitler backers. We do know that prominent European and American industrialists were sponsoring all manner of totalitarian political groups at that time, including communists and various Nazi groups. The U.S. Kilgore Committee records that by 1919, Krupp was already giving financial aid to one of the reactionary political groups which sowed the seed for the present Nazi ideology. Hugo Steins was an early contributor to the Nazi Party. By 1924, other prominent industrialists and financiers, among them Fritz Thyssen, Albert Vogler, Adolf Kierorf, and Kurt von Schroeder, were secretly giving substantial sums to the Nazis. In 1931, members of the Coal Workers Association, which Kierorf headed, pledged themselves to pay 50 pfennigs for each ton of coal sold, the money to go to the organization which Hitler was building. Hitler's 1924 Munich trial yielded evidence that the Nazis received $20,000 from Nuremberg industrialists. The most interesting name from this period is that of Emil Kierorf, who had earlier acted as a conduit for financing German involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution. Kierorf's role in financing Hitler was, in his own words, in 1923, I came into contact for the first time with the National Socialist movement. I first heard the Fuhrer in the Essen exhibition hall. His clear exposition completely convinced and overwhelmed me. In 1927, I first met the Fuhrer personally. I traveled to Munich, and there had a conversation with the Fuhrer in the Bruckmann home. During 4.5 hours, Adolf Hitler explained to me his program in detail. I begged the Fuhrer to put together the lecture he had given me in the form of a pamphlet. I then distributed this pamphlet in my name in business and manufacturing circles. Since then, I have placed myself completely at the disposition of his movement. Shortly after our Munich conversation, and as a result of the pamphlet which the Fuhrer composed and I distributed, a number of meetings took place between the Fuhrer and leading personalities in the field of industry. For the last time before the taking of power, the leaders of industry met in my house together with Adolf Hitler, Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, and other leading personalities of the party. In 1925, the Hugo Stinnes family contributed funds to convert the Nazi Weekly to a daily publication. Putzi Hafstignell, Franklin D. Roosevelt's friend and protege, provided the remaining funds. Table 7.1 summarizes presently known financial contributions and the business associations of contributors from the United States. Putzi is not listed in Table 7.1 as he was neither industrialist nor financier. In the early 1930s, financial assistance to Hitler began to flow more readily. There took place in Germany a series of meetings irrefutably documented in several sources between German industrialists, Hitler himself, and more often Hitler's representatives, Hjalmar Schacht and Rudolf Hess. The critical point is that the German industrialists financing Hitler were predominantly directors of the cartels with American associations, ownership, participation, or some form of subsidiary connection. The Hitler backers were not, by and large, firms of purely German origin or representatives of German family business, except for Thyssen and Kurdorf. In most cases, they were German multinational firms, i.e. IG Farben, AEG, DAPAG. These multinationals had been built up by American loans in the 1920s and in the early 1930s, had American directors, and heavy American financial participation. One flow of foreign political funds, not considered here, is that reported from the European-based Royal Dutch Shell, Standard Oil's great competitor in the 1920s and 30s, and a giant brainchild of the Anglo-Dutch businessman Sir Henry Detterding. It has been widely asserted that Henry Detterding personally financed Hitler. This argument is made, for instance, by biographer Giles Roberts in The Most Powerful Man in the World. Roberts notes that as Detterding was impressed with Hitler as early as 1921, and the Dutch press reported that through the agent George Bell, the Detterding had placed at Hitler's disposal, while the party was still in long clothes, no less than 4 million guilders. It was reported by Roberts that in 1931, George Bell, Dettering's agent, and attended meetings of Ukrainian patriots in Paris as joint delegate of Hitler and Dettering. Roberts also reports Detterding was accused, as Edgar Ansel Maurer testifies in his German puts the clock back, of putting up a large sum of money for the Nazis on the understanding that success would give him a favorable position in the German oil market. On other occasions, figures as high as £55 million were mentioned. Biographer Roberts really found Detterding's strong anti-Bolshevism distasteful, and rather than presenting hard evidence of funding, he is inclined to assume rather than prove that Detterding was pro-Hitler. But pro-Hitlerism was not necessarily a consequence of anti-Bolshevism. In any event, Roberts offers no proof of finance, and hard evidence of Dettering's involvement was not found by this author. Maurer's book contains neither index nor footnotes as to the source of his information, and Roberts has no specific evidence for his accusations. There is circumstantial evidence that Detterding was pro-Nazi. He later went to live in Hitler's Germany and increased his share of the German petroleum market, so there may have been some contributions, but these have not been proven. Similarly, in France, on January the 11th, 1942, Paul Fere, a member of the Chambre des Pieux, accused the French industrial firm of Schneider Kreuzoy of financing Hitler, and incidentally implicated Wall Street and other financing channels. The Schneider Group is a famous firm of French armaments manufacturers. After recalling the Schneider's influence in establishing a fascism in Hungary and its extensive international armaments operations, Paul Fere turns to Hitler and quotes from the French journal Le Journal that Hitler had received 300,000 Swiss gold francs from subscriptions opened in Holland under the case of a university professor named von Bissing. The Skoda plant at Pilsen, stated Paul Fere, was controlled by the French Schneider family, and it was the Skoda directors von Duschnitz and von Artaber who made these subscriptions to Hitler. Fere concluded, "I am disturbed to see the directors of Skoda, controlled by Schneider, subsidizing the electoral campaign of Mr. Hitler. I am disturbed to see your firm, your financiers, your industrial cartels unite themselves with the most nationalistic of Germans." Again, no hard evidence was found for the alleged flow of Hitler funds. Fritz Thyssen and W.A. Harriman Company of New York. Another elusive case of reported financing of Hitler is that of Fritz Thyssen, the German steel magnate who associated himself with the German movement in the early 1920s. When interrogated in 1945 under Project Dustbin, Thyssen recalled that he was approached in 1923 by General Ludendorff at the time of the French evacuation of the Ruhr. Shortly after this meeting, Thyssen was introduced to Hitler and provided funds for the Nazis through General Ludendorff. In 1931-1933, Emil Kurdorf approached Thyssen and subsequently sent Rudolf Hess to negotiate further funding for the Nazi Party. This time, Thyssen arranged a credit for 250,000 marks at the Bank voor Handel and Scheepvaart N.V. at 18 Zuldeblock in Rotterdam, Holland, founded in 1918 with H.J. Kouwenhoven and D.C. Schutte as managing partners. This bank was a subsidiary of the AG Thyssen Bank of Germany, formerly von der Heydens Bank AG. It was Thyssen's personal banking operation and was affiliated with W.A. Harriman Financial Interests in New York. Thyssen reported to his Project Dustbin interrogators that I chose a Dutch bank because I did not want to be mixed up with German banks in my position, and because I thought it was better to do business with the Dutch bank, and I thought I would have the Nazis a little more in my hands. Thyssen's book, I Paid Hitler, published in 1941, was purported to be written by Fritz Thyssen himself, although Thyssen denies authorship. The book claims that funds for Hitler, about 1 million marks, came mainly from Thyssen himself. I Paid Hitler has other unsupported assertions, for example, that Hitler was actually descended from an illegitimate child of the Rothschild family. Supposedly, Hitler's grandmother, Frau Schicklgruber, had been a servant in the Rothschild household and while there became pregnant. An inquiry once ordered by the late Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss yielded some interesting results, owing to the fact that the dossiers of the police department of the Austro-Hungarian monarch were remarkably complete. This assertion concerning Hitler's illegitimacy is refuted entirely in a more solidly based book by Eugene Davidson, which implicates the Frankenberger family, not the Rothschild family. In any event, more relevant from our viewpoint than the August Thyssen Front Bank in Holland, i.e. the Bank voor Handel en Scheepvaart, and V controlled the Union Banking Corporation in New York. The Harrimans had a financial interest in, and E. Ronald Harriman, Averill's brother, was director of this Union Banking Corporation. The Union Banking Corporation of New York was a joint Thyssen-Harriman operation with the following directors of 1932. E. Ronald Harriman, Vice President of W.A. Harriman & Co., New York. H.J. Cowenhoven, Nazi banker and managing partner of August Thyssen Bank and Bank voor Handel Scheepvaart N.V., the transfer bank for Thyssen's funds. J.G. Groningen, the Steel Cartel which funded Hitler. G. Livenes, President Union Banking Corp. New York City. E.S. James, partner Brown, later Brown Brothers, Harriman & Co. Table 7.1, financial links between U.S. industry and Adolf Hitler. Thyssen arranged a credit of 250,000 marks for Hitler through this Dutch bank affiliated with the Harrimans. Thyssen's book, later repudiated, states that as much as 1 million marks came from Thyssen. Thyssen's U.S. partners were, of course, prominent members of the Wall Street financial establishment. Edward Henry Harriman, the 19th century railroad magnate, had two sons, W. Averill Harriman, born 1891, and E. Ronald Harriman, born 1895. In 1917, W. Averill Harriman was a director of Guarantee Trust Company, and he was involved in the Bolshevik Revolution. According to his biographer, Averill started at the bottom of the career ladder as a clerk and a section hand after leaving Yale in 1913. Then he moved steadily forward to positions of increasing responsibility in the fields of transportation and finance. In addition to his directorship in Guarantee Trust, Harriman formed the Merchant Shipbuilding Corporation in 1917, which soon became the largest merchant fleet under American flag. This fleet was disposed of in 1925, and Harriman entered the lucrative Russian market. In winding up these Russian deals in 1929, Averill Harriman received a windfall profit of $1 million from the usually hard-headed Soviets, who had a reputation of giving nothing away without some present or later quid pro quo. Concurrently with these successive moves in international finance, Averill Harriman had always been attracted by the so-called public service. In 1913, Harriman's public service began with an appointment to the Palisades Park Commission. In 1933, Harriman was appointed chairman of the New York State Committee of Employment, and in 1934 became administrative officer of Roosevelt's NRA, the Mussolini-like brainchild of General Electric's Gerard Swoop. There followed a stream of public offices, first the Lend-Lease program, then as ambassador to the Soviet Union, later as Secretary of Commerce. By contrast, E. Ronald Harriman confined his activities to private business and international finance, without venturing, as did brother Averill, into public service. In 1922, Ronald and Averill formed a W.A. Harriman & Company. Still later, Ronald became chairman of the board of Union Pacific Railroad and a director of Newsweek magazine, Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, a member of the board of governors of the American Red Cross, and a member of the American Museum of Natural History. Nazi financier Hendrik Cowenhoven, Ronald Harriman's fellow director at Union Banking Corporation in New York, was managing director of the Bank voor Handel en Scheepvaart N.V. of Rotterdam. In 1940, the BHS held approximately 2.2 million U.S. assets in the Union Banking Corporation, which in turn did most of its business with BHS. In the 1930s, Kouwenhoven was also director of the Verenigde Staalwerk AG, the steel cartel founded with Wall Street funds in the mid-1920s. Later, like Baron Schroeder, he was a prominent Hitler supporter. Another director of the New York Union Banking Corporation was Johann Groninger, a German subject with numerous industrial and financial affiliations involving Verenigde Staalwerk, the August-Thyssen Group, and directorship of August-Thyssen Hout AG. This affiliation and mutual business interest between Harriman and the Thyssen interest does not suggest that the Harrimans directly financed Hitler. On the other hand, it does show that the Harrimans were intimately connected with the prominent Nazis Kouwenhoven and Groninger in a Nazi front bank, the Bank voor Handel en Scheepvaart. This is every reason to believe that the Harrimans knew of Thyssen's support for the Nazis. In case of the Harrimans, it is important to bear in mind their long-lasting and intimate relationship with the Soviet Union and the Harrimans' position at the center of Roosevelt's New Deal and the Democratic Party. The evidence suggests that some members of the Wall Street elite are connected with and certainly have influence with all significant political groupings in the contemporary world socialist spectrum: Soviet socialism, Hitler's National Socialism, and Roosevelt's New Deal socialism. Financing Hitler in the March 1933 general election. Putting the George Bell, Duttering, and Thyssen-Harriman cases to one side, we now examine the core of Hitler's backing. In May 1932, the so-called Kaiserhof meeting took place between Schmidt of IG Farben, Max Ilgner of American IG Farben, Kuyp of Hans of Hamburg American Line, and DM of German Potash Trust. More than 500,000 marks were raised at this meeting and deposited to the credit of Rudolf Hess and the Deutsche Bank. It is noteworthy, in light of the Warburg myth described in Chapter 10, that Max Ilgner was of the American IG Farben, contributed 100 million Reichsmarks, or 1/5 of the total. The Sidney Warburg book claims Warburg involvement in the funding of Hitler, and Paul Warburg was director of American IG Farben, while Max Warburg was director of IG Farben. There exists irrefutable documentary evidence of a further role of international bankers and industrialists in the financing of the Nazi Party and the Volksparty for the March 1933 German election. A total of 3 million Reichsmarks was subscribed by prominent firms and businessmen, suitably washed through an account at the Delbruck Schickler Bank, and then passed into the hands of Rudolf Hess for use by Hitler and the NSDAP. This transfer of funds was followed by the Reichstag fire, abrogation of constitutional rights, and consolidation of Nazi power. Access to the Reichstag by the arsonists was obtained through a tunnel from a house where Putzi Hofstadel was staying. The Reichstag fire itself was used by Hitler as a pretext to abolish constitutional rights. In brief, within a few weeks of the major funding of Hitler, there was a linked sequence of major events: the financial contribution from prominent bankers and industrialists to the 1933 election, burning of the Reichstag, abrogation of constitutional rights, and the subsequent seizure of power by the Nazi Party. The fundraising meeting was held February 20th, 1933 in the home of Göring, who was then president of the Reichstag, with Hjalmar Horst Greely Schacht acting as host. Among these present, according to IG Farben's von Schnitzler, were Krupp von Bohlen, who beginning in 1933 was president. Yeah, I'm not even going to say that. Dr. Albert Vogler, the leading man of Verenigde Staalwerk, von Lohenfeld, Dr. Stein, a mine which belongs to the IG. Hitler expounded his political views to the assembled businessmen in a lengthy 2.5 hour speech, using the threat of communism and a communist takeover to great effect. It is not enough to say that we do not want communism in our economy. If we contribute on our own political course, then we shall perish. It is the noblest task of the leader to find ideals that are stronger than the factors that put the people together. I recognize, even while in the hospital, that one had to search for new ideas conducive to reconstruction. I found them in nationalism, in the value of personality, and in the denial of a reconciliation between nations. Now we stand before the last election. Regardless of the outcome, there will be no retreat, even if the coming election does not bring about a decision. One way or another, if the election does not decide, the decision must be brought about by other means. I have intervened in order to give the people once more the chance to decide their fate by themselves. There are only two possibilities: either to crowd people back the opponent on constitutional grounds, and for this purpose once more this election, or a struggle will be conducted with other weapons, which may demand greater sacrifices. I hope the German people thus recognize the greatness of the hour. After Hitler had spoken, Kraut von Bohlen expressed the support of the assembled industrialists and bankers in the concrete form of a 3 million mark political fund. It turned out to be more than enough to acquire power, because 600,000 marks remained unexpended after the election. Hallmar Schacht, organizing this historic meeting. We have previously described Schacht's links with the United States. His father was cashier for the Berlin branch of Equitable Assurance, and Hallmar was intimately involved almost on a monthly basis with Wall Street. The largest contributor to the fund was IG Farben, which committed itself for 80%, or 500,000 marks of the total. Director A. Steinke of BUBIAG, an IG Farben subsidiary, personally contributed another 200,000 marks. In brief, 45% of the funds for the 1933 election came from IG Farben. If we look at the directors of American IG Farben, the U.S. subsidiary of IG Farben, we get close to the roots of Wall Street involvement with Hitler. The board of American IG Farben at this time contained some of the most prestigious names among American industrialists. And still B. Ford of the Ford Motor Company, C.E. Mitchell of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and Walter Teagle, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. Paul M. Warburg, first director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and chairman of the Bank of Manhattan, was a Farben director, and in Germany his brother Max Warburg was also director of IG Farben. H. A. Metz of IG Farben was also a director of the Warburg's Bank of Manhattan. Finally, Karl Bosch of American IG Farben was also a director of Ford Motor Company AG in Germany. 3 board members of American IG Farben were found guilty at the Nuremberg war crimes trial: Max Ilgner, F. Termeer, and Hermann Schmitz. As we have noted, the American board members, that's Ford, C.E. Mitchell, Walter Teagle, and Paul Warburg, were not placed on trial at Nuremberg, and so far as their records are concerned, it appears that they were not even questioned about their knowledge of the 1933 Hitler Fund. All right. The 1933 political contributions. Who were the industrialists and bankers who placed election funds at the disposal of the Nazi Party in 1933? The list of contributors and the amounts of their contribution is as follows. Kuradorf, 600,000 US dollars pledged, 45.8%. Edsel Ford, C.E. Mitchell, Walter Teagle, Paul Warburg, $400,000, 3.5%. Automobile Exhibition Berlin, 100,000, 7.6%. AEG, Gerard Swoop, Owen Young, C.H. Miner, Arthur Baldwin, 60,000, 4.6%. DMAG, 50,000, 3.8%. Orem GmbH, Owen Young, 40,000, 3.3%. Telefunk Gesellschaft Telegraphic, 85,000, 2.7%. Quadrant AEG, 25,000, 1.9%. Karl Hermann, 300,000. Director A. Steinke, 200,000. Director Karl Lange, 50,000. Dr. F. Springelrum, 36,000. Source: see appendix for translation of original document. How can we prove these political payments actually took place? The payments to Hitler in this first step on the road to dictatorial Nazism were made through the private bank of Delbruck Schickler. The Delbruck Schickler Bank was a subsidiary of Metall, an industrial giant, the largest non-ferrous metal company in Germany, and the dominant influence in the world of non-ferrous metal trading. The principal shareholders of Metall were IG Farben and the British Metal Corporation. We might note incidentally that the British directors on the Metall were Walter Gardner, Amalgamated Metal Corporation, and Captain Oliver Littleton, also on the board of Amalgamated Metal, and paradoxically later in World War II to become the British Minister of Production. There exists among the Nuremberg trial papers the original transfer slips from the banking division of IG Farben and other firms listed on page 110 to the Delbrück Bank in Berlin, informing the bank of the transfer of funds from Dresdner Bank and other banks to their national trusteeship account. This account was dispersed by Rudolf Hess for Nazi Party expenses during the election. Translation of the IG Farben transfer slip selected as a sample is as follows. Translation of the IG Farben letter of February 27, 1933, advising for transfer of 400,000 Reichsmarks to the national trusteeship account. We are informing you herewith that we have authorized the Dresdner Bank in Frankfurt M to pay you tomorrow forenoon 400,000 Reichsmarks, which you will use in favor of the account national trusteeship. At this juncture, we should take note of the efforts that have been made to direct our attention away from American financiers and German financiers connected with American affiliated companies who were involved with the funding of Hitler. Usually the blame for financing Hitler has been placed exclusively upon Fritz Thyssen or Emil Kurdorf. In the case of Thyssen, this blame was widely circulated in a book allegedly authored by Thyssen in the middle of World War II, but later repudiated by him. Why Thyssen would want to admit such actions before the defeat of Nazism is unexplained. Emil Kurdorf, who died in 1937, was always proud of his association with the rise of Nazism. The attempt to limit Hitler financing to Thyssen and Kurdorf extended into the Nuremberg trials in 1946 and was challenged only by the Soviet delegate. Even the Soviet delegate was unwilling to produce evidence of American associations. This is not surprising because the Soviet Union depends on the goodwill of the same financiers to transfer much-needed advanced Western technology to the USSR. At Nuremberg, statements were made and allowed to go unchallenged, which were directly contrary to the known direct evidence presented above. For example, Bucher, Director General of German General Electric, was absolved from sympathy for Hitler. Thyssen had confessed his error like a man and has courageously paid a heavy penalty for it. On the other side stand men like Roos of the, I'm not going to say that, Karl Bosch, the later chairman of IG Farben, who would very likely have come to a sad end had he not died in time. Their feelings were shared by the deputy chairman of Kahl. The Siemens and AEG companies, which next to IG Farben were the most powerful German concerns, and they were determined opponents of National Socialism. I know that this unfriendly attitude on the part of the Siemens concerned to the Nazis resulted in their firm receiving rather rough treatment. The director of General AEG, Guy Bucher, who I know from my stay in the colonies was anything but a Nazi, I can assure General Taylor that it is certainly wrong to assert that the leading industrialists as such favored Hitler before his seizure of power. Yet, on page 56 of this book, we produced a document originating with General Electric, transferring General Electric funds to the National Trusteeship account controlled by Rudolf Hess on behalf of Hitler and used in the 1933 elections. Similarly, von Schnitzler, who was present at the February 1933 meeting on behalf of IG Farben, denied IG Farben's contributions to the 1933 National Treuhand. I never heard again of the whole matter that of financing Hitler, but I believe that either the Bureau of Goering Schacht or the Reichsverband der Deutschen Industrie had asked the office of Bosch or Schmidt for payment of IG share in the electric fund. As I did not take the matter up again, I not even at the time knew whether and which amount had been paid by the IG. According to the volume of IG, I should estimate IG shares being something like 10% of the electrical election fund, but as far as I know, there's no evidence that IG Farben participated in the payments. And as we have seen, the evidence is incontrovertible regarding political cash contributions to Hitler at the crucial point of the takeover of power in Germany. And Hitler's earlier speech to the industrialists clearly reveals that a coercive takeover was the premeditated intent. We know exactly who contributed how much and through what channels. It is notable that the largest contributors are IG Farben, German General Electric, and its affiliated company Osram and Thyssen were affiliated with Wall Street financiers. These Wall Street financiers were at the heart of the financial elite, and they were prominent in contemporary American politics. Gerard Swoop of General Electric was the author of Roosevelt's New Deal. Teagle was one of NRA's top administrators, Paul Warburg and his associates, and American IG Farben were Roosevelt advisors. It is perhaps not an extraordinary coincidence that Roosevelt's New Deal, called a fascist measure by Herbert Hoover, should have so closely resembled Hitler's program for Germany, and that both Hitler and Roosevelt took power in the same month of the same year, March 1933. All right, everyone, that's what we have for tonight. I'll just say hello to Minoan, Corbin, and Conquay Home. Hello, everyone. So make sure to tune in next week for part 5 of Wall Street and Hitler. It's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.